Salutations, respected viewers. I'm George from Ireland, and here I am in Clapham, London. So what I wanted to point out to you here is number 36 Buckmaster Road, that black door behind me. Because this is where Bruce Reynolds spent some of his formative years, because his grandmother lived here. Bruce Reynolds, who, well, according to himself, was the mastermind of the great train robbery. So he would have you believe he's the Napoleon of crime. There are many people who say it was really his accomplice and his long-time confrère, Gordon Goody, who was really the brains behind the operation, salvaged it when things started to go wrong, and the train driver they brought along couldn't do it. So this is it. This is the house, obviously not open to the public, and the current owners probably have no idea of its association with Bruce Reynolds and might be none too pleased with me pointing it out. You ought to read his unputdownable book, Autobiography of a Thief, by Bruce Reynolds. So anyway, he's born in September 1931 at Charing Cross Hospital, which really was at Charing Cross, beside the Charing Cross station in those days. Obviously subsequently moved out to Chelsea. But anyway, so his mother was a nurse and they were paid abysmally in those days. His father was a veteran of the First World War, did all sorts of odd jobs. His grandfather was a veteran of the First World War. His father done all sorts of odd jobs, like including being a barman at the Star and Garter. But anyway, so unemployed on and off during the Great Depression. Bruce Reynolds had a baby sister who died in infancy. Anyhow, then his mother died when Bruce Reynolds was a toddler. Later, his father remarried and had more children, but he never got along with his stepmother, Bruce Reynolds. He started nicking money out of his purse. So they were living over in Putney, and I filmed outside their house too. But Bruce was often spending time with his grandmother here, so he got along very well with her. She was quite religious, of the Catholic denomination. So Reynolds had some 17th century French ancestry, hence the surname Reynolds, because Reynolds is a well-known French surname. One of his related to Albert Reynolds, the Taoiseach of Ireland. And there was a well-known Protestant clergyman in the early 17th century with that name as well. And some people who weren't even related to him just started taking that name. But what else about Bruce Reynolds? So he left school at 14, that was the norm at the time. He was clearly quite a bright person, but he was involved in petty crime from an early age, did various office jobs because he was fairly academic, but he found these understimulating, and he went into larceny for various reasons, not only to line his pockets, but also for the sheer thrill of it. He said nothing compares to the buzz of purloining things. So he liked to pit his wits against others and the police. And he went sent to Borstal, and he had a bad experience with the police just after the Second World War. Not far from here, cycling on Queenstown Road, towards Battersea Park. He had no lights, and the police tried to stop him, so he swore at a police officer and he sped off. So then a police car pulled up beside him and said, "Are you the one who was just rude to a police officer a while ago?" He said, No, not me. But then, puffing hard, the policeman he'd sworn at on a bicycle came up behind him. So he was persuaded to go under arrest. And he recalls how an older police officer, grandfatherly type, said, "Son, just come quietly, it'll be all right." So Bruce Reynolds said, "Okay, you're taking a reasonable approach, so I will." So sat in the back of the police car, and then suddenly he found that the older police officer had pinned his arms behind his back and said, "Right, I've got him, little shit," and they gave him several whacks. This is all going solely on Reynolds' testimony. So he was taken to the police station. His grandmother was informed, and they wouldn't give her a lift to the police station. She got there to see his face badly bruised. She thought nothing he could have done could have possibly merited such a hiding. Anyway, he was released, but he was very much against the police, very much against the armed forces, the establishment. He said he was a budding Marxist, but he was not a class warrior. He was not about redistributing wealth. He wasn't trying to help anyone. He was completely selfish like that. And he says his grandmother would quite like to have met the Pope, and so in return for a handsome donation, this could be arranged, but he never ever did it, of course. Anyway, so he's in and out of prison a lot for short sentences and escaped to prison and finally conscripted into the army. This has been the time of national service when all boys had to do 2 years in either the army, the Royal Navy, the RAF, and he picked the army. And he was in a camp not too far from London, but he disliked it and he bunked off very quickly. He found that some of the posh boys were contumelious of him, and even some of the sergeants knew he'd been in Borstal and sneered at him for this. But anyway, he snuck out of the camp, and obviously if you find railway lines, you know where you're going. Being all steam trains in those days, well, so you didn't have to worry about a third rail. It wasn't electrified. The days of puff-puff trains were fine for walking along the railway lines. They weren't fenced off. you know you're going somewhere if you follow those in the middle of the night when there are no trains around, and obviously jump off the tracks if a train is coming. You're going to hear them and see them 8 miles away, and getting back to London and being caught and sent back. And eventually the army gave up on him, so he's a career criminal. I won't tell you the whole story of the great train robbery, but he was already a seasoned criminal. He'd never spent too long in prison, 2 years at the max. So then about 1961, he recalled going on holiday to Cannes with his then girlfriend, and she was of Irish extraction. He wasn't remotely anti-Irish. He said, you know, she had a Catholic upbringing, and Catholic girls were either saints or sinners, and she certainly wasn't a saint. But anyway, she was pregnant, and he said, up until that time, if I found out my girlfriend was pregnant, my first reaction would have been to suggest an abortion. Of course, totally illegal in those days, and dangerous, because the person doing it wouldn't be a doctor. He or she wouldn't know what they're doing and could accidentally kill the woman as well as the baby. I suppose killing the baby was the whole point. But anyway, he decided, no, let's give birth to this baby since they got married. And he seemed to genuinely love his wife and his son, who's still alive, who was a well-known musician, and that was that. But then the great train robbery was in the offing. November 1962 was the Battle of Heathrow, a robbery of a large cash delivery at Heathrow Airport, which regarded coshing various people delivering large amount of cash in briefcases. So Bruce Reynolds and his gang were wearing suits because only the very wealthy could afford to fly in 1962, so they wouldn't seem out of place hanging around an airport. And they got away with it. They had a racing car driver as their getaway driver. And then finally in 1963, looking into robbing trains, it was the South Coast Raiders around the Brighton area who'd been stopping trains and robbing trains for a long time, because they realised large amounts of cash were transported by train with very few guards around. And they had some inside information. They thought about robbing the Irish Mail. That went awry, as both he and Gordon Goody recall in their autobiographies. Gordon Goody's book is called How to Rob a Train. He only died about 3 years ago in Spain, where Goody was running a bar for the last 20 odd years of his life. But anyway, so they then found out about this Glasgow to London overnight train, and it took lots of banknotes being withdrawn from circulation, and they were burnt when they got to London. Why not burn them where they are? And things like that, sacks and sacks of them. So they had some inside information from the Ulsterman, whose name wasn't revealed until a couple of years ago. So then August 1963 was to go ahead. They brought the South Coast Raiders, some of them into the plot. They got a train driver. The idea was to stop the train by manipulating the signals, show the red light, and then the train driver would have to stop, assuming there's something up ahead, and then masked men would board the train. They'd separate the locomotive and the heavy goods, the high value packages coach from the rest of the train, and drive it a mile on to Bredego Bridge in Buckinghamshire. They'd unload it, forming a human train, and get their sacks and put them into lorries and drive them off. And the idea is they wouldn't try and drive off straight away. They'd bought a Leatherslade farm a few months earlier, which was about 27 miles from Bredego Bridge. And they got themselves army surplus uniforms. They're dressing up as soldiers because it'd be rather suspicious driving around at 3 o'clock in the morning. Not many people had cars in 1963. Not many cars driving around in deepest Buckinghamshire in the middle of the night. But if anyone saw them, they would assume they were soldiers on night exercise. Bear in mind the British Army was much bigger in those days. It was about 400,000 soldiers strong. And most of these guys had actually been in the army, so knew how to behave. And if the police came along, Reynolds was going to impersonate an officer, and he had fantasies about being upper class, and he was going to talk down to them and tell them to go away, you silly little man, and dressing up like an SAS guy. Well, you've got to read the whole tale. I mean, so many films, so many iterations of this story in various books as well. The definitive version may never be known. But anyway, that was Bruce Reynolds. His grandmother had died by this stage. So Buckmaster, ironically, Buckmaster was the name of a famous judge of the 1920s and 1930s. You'll see his ruling in the O'Donoghue case. So I wonder if this is named in his honor. Probably not. It looks a bit older than that. Anyway, Reynolds, he ran off to Mexico with his wife and child. He'd spent all the money by 1968, came back, and he was nicked in Torquay. He used to go there as a child on holiday. But the criminal underground, well, some of them were informants from the police, and the word got out in the grapevine that he was back. He was attempting more heists, and he went to prison. He only served 14 years, if I got that right, of a 25-year sentence, and some of his accomplices got up to 35 years. So that was him. He was released, and he said he kept his nose clean after then. He'd already climbed Mount Everest in terms of crime, so there was nothing to be had. And he said he never touched drugs. Well, in prison he smoked cannabis, but he never tried to deal it. But nevertheless, he said he was wrongfully convicted in the early 80s, the only time he ever pleaded not guilty. and spent a couple of years in prison, but lived out the rest of his life in Croydon. He only died in February 2013, had a typical gangland send-off. So that is Bruce Reynolds, an absolutely scintillating character. I can't say his story is morally uplifting, but he was able to reassess what made him happy. But it's not completely self-justificatory. There's humour in it. It's somewhat fictionalised, but it's a right riveting read, warmly recommended. Well, that is enough about Bruce Reynolds and his association with Clapham.